Welcome to today's live stream. I'm going to get started in a minute. I just need to let everybody know that the stream is going on. Okay, what's going on, Bombboard? Glad to see you here. Thank you for the donation again. I really appreciate it. Gonna get started in a minute. Just want everybody to get noted a lot today. And today's live stream is going to be about paying off a story. And this is something many writers don't really think about too much, which is the ending of their story. Because a lot of times when you have writers, they are caught up in their feelings about the premise, and oftentimes they'll focus heavily on the setup. And what you have to do once you focused on the setup, you really have to think about paying off that story. And what is paying off a story? Paying off a story is providing the audience with a satisfying conclusion and giving them a conclusion that leads to them anticipating, looking forward to your next story. Now, a lot of writers, they will focus on the first act very heavily, where they introduce the characters, they introduce the conflict, they introduce the premise, but they will take for granted that third act of the story. And if you take the third act of the story for granted, you are going to wind up in a situation where you wind up possibly turning off the reader. Now, in storytelling, all three acts of the story are very important, and each act is important because if you can't get your reader to the finish line, then you really have not done your job as a writer. And a lot of writers, they don't really think about the finish line too much. They think that, oh, the ending will work itself out. But when you do the ending, it just can't work itself out. It has to be something that is organic. It has to be something that flows from the story. And it has to be something that provides the reader with a satisfying conclusion to the action introduced in the first part of the story. So you have to make sure that your ending pays off, because if your ending doesn't pay off, then what's going to happen is your reader is just going to wind up feeling unsatisfied about that story. And if a reader feels unsatisfied about the story, then what happens is, if they're not satisfied, then they are not going to see your writing in a positive light. And if you're writing a story and the reader isn't satisfied, then what's going to happen is, especially if you're publishing work, you're not going to be able to get those readers to pick up other works in your catalog. And if you're doing a series, then what's going to happen is the reader is going to wind up not wanting to pick up back books in the series or pick up the next book in a series. So a payoff has to really deliver the goods as related to giving people a satisfying conclusion to the story. And your payoff is something that you have to give the reader, because this reader has invested time in reading your story, and the time that they've invested, they want to see a return on the dividends, and that return is an ending that really satisfies them and makes them believe that this story came to a satisfying conclusion. So the payoff is very important, and it's just something you can't take for granted, because if you can't pay a story off, then what's going to happen is the reader is going to look at the story and say, I wasted my time. And that relates directly back to the question that your writers have to answer, the three big ones: who is the main character, what do they want, and most importantly, why we should care. And if you can't make the reader care about the ending, then that's going to affect your beginning as related to your next writing project. Because as Sid Field stated in his classic book, Screenplay, stories are about endings and beginnings. So every story's ending should lead to a beginning, and that ending should lead to the reader looking at the book and saying to themselves, well, what's next here? Because what you want to do is build that anticipation for your next work. Because if you build that anticipation for your next work in your previous work, then you've already done a lot of work towards selling the next book and building that anticipation for the next book. So that's something you really want to do with your work when you're writing a story, is really set up a plan for your ending, because it's that ending that is going to sell the beginning of your next story. So paying off a story is very important, but it's something, again, people really don't think too much about, but it's something every writer needs to think about when they're writing a story. Now, when I write stories, a lot of times I don't really have an idea of what the ending is in some cases, but I usually try to have like a sketch of where I want this story to end. And the reason why I want to have a little bit of a sketch for where I want the story to end, because I know that this needs to be what the payoff is, because the story, if I have a sketch of what I want the story to pay out to be, then I have something that can give the reader some sort of hope as related to the ending before I even write that ending, and that ending can be something that will go out here and leave the reader satisfied at the end of the story. So I usually try to sketch out what I want the ending to be. Sometimes it doesn't go that way, but I usually try to sketch out an ending before I begin writing the story. I did that with Spellbound, and I did it with several John Haynes books and ISIS books. I always try to have an ending planned before I start writing, because if you have an ending, then you know what the payoff is, and then you know how to deliver the payoff. All you have to do is just start doing your and you know where you want to go, and all you have to do is just make sure you deliver to that ending. Now, the whole thing with endings is that some people think that some writers think that if you do and have an ending plan, that you're going to spoil the story. But sometimes I don't believe that it spoils the story. What that does is it gives you a direction for where you want to go, and it allows you to set a course for where you want to go with the story. So having an idea of where you want your ending to be gives you a outline or a course of a destination for where you want to take the story. So I look at a lot of comic books these days, and I'm seeing a lot of problems as related to paying off. And an example of that was shown to me when I was looking at this Doomsday Clock, which is supposed to be the big event for DC Comics, there was all of this hype around your Doomsday Clock, and they set up this fantastic premise of this sequel to Watchmen and somebody manipulating the DC universe. But what's going on, Mike? Glad to see you here. Mike he designed the cover for John Haynes' Dark Succubus, which is now available on Amazon. This is Mike's cover. I'm glad to see him here. Akun, I haven't read any Manga Monster yet. Haven't read much manga myself, but I would be interested in it. But Mike designed this cover, and I'm talking about, paying off a story. And I was reading Doomsday Clock, and they did this great setup, but it looks like it's gonna fizzle out on the payoff. Now, this was one of the big stories for DC Comics. It was supposed to be a story to set up something as related to what's going on with the failure of the New 52, the convergence, the rebirth, and trying to get things on track towards getting to the classic DC universe. But the story has been plagued with a lot of problems as related to the execution. Jeff Johns has really struggled on the execution, and I believe one of the reasons why he struggled on the execution has to do with the fact that he has a lot on his plate. He's trying to write TV shows, he's trying to produce TV shows, and that can really affect your payoff if your focus isn't clear. So as a writer, if you want to pay your story off, you have to be very focused on what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. Because if you're not focused on it, you can get something like Doomsday Clock, where you get this fantastic setup for this epic event, but then it's looking like it's going to fizzle out, because after reading issue 11, where we get this, penny ultimate climax to this confrontation between Superman and Dr. Manhattan, it's not looking like the payoff is going to come with this story. So I feel like after what I've read, I don't really see that big payoff coming for all of the time readers have spent investing in the story. And that's one of the things that happens when you really don't focus on what destination you want to take the reader as related to your story. Because if you don't focus on where you want to go with the story, then when you get to the payoff stage, the reader doesn't get that payoff. And when they don't get that payoff, what that leads to is bad word of mouth. And that bad word of mouth can lead to you alienating your audience. And that word of mouth can lead to you having a hard time selling your next book that's upcoming, or it can lead to you winding up not being able to sell your back work on your backlist. So that's why payoffs are very important, because if you give a reader a satisfying conclusion to a story, what that reader is going to do when they get that satisfying conclusion is that's going to get them excited, and that's going to get them anticipating your next work. So when you're a writer, it's not just about you crafting a great story for entertainment purposes, but it is also about you focusing on what you want to do business-wise, because writing is a business when you're doing stories for the reader, and you want to be able to sell your story by making sure your craft is rock solid. And that's one of the things a writer does when they want to work towards a payoff, because they know that it's not only paying off in relation to giving that reader a satisfying conclusion, but it is also paying off in terms of giving a reader a great story so that they can go out here and sell more stories to the reader. And again, with the Doomsday Clock, I saw a whole thing with this big setup and no payoff. And I also saw it with Tom King's Batman, where your Tom King has done all of this work towards setting up this supposedly grand 100-issue Batman run, but that grand 100-issue Batman run has practically fizzled out by the 50th issue because your Tom King was not focused on payoff. And when I look at many of his storylines, this is where he struggles overall. He'll have these brilliant setups like he did for the first couple of issues, but by that 50th issue, where he was supposed to pay off the story, I mean, he got readers anticipating this wedding between Bruce and Selina, Batman and Catwoman, and got everybody excited for what they thought was going to be a satisfying conclusion. But instead of him giving the reader that satisfying conclusion, what he did was make it where Selina left Bruce at the altar. And then after that, we got beta male Batman being emotional. And then we got these meandering stories that could be a dream or could be reality. And this was frustrating for the reader because the reader did not come to a Batman comic book looking for a meandering story. What they wanted was that big payoff, and they wanted that big payoff to come because they wanted to be able to get that payoff, but they didn't get that payoff. And because they didn't get that payoff, Batman's sales have plummeted ever since. And many people had been calling for Tom King to be removed from the Batman book. And that all happened because your Tom King just doesn't understand how to pay off a story. I also saw this with Tom King's Mr. Miracle, where he set up all these grand ideas, but because he didn't know how to write a satisfying ending to the series, this is what led to the Mr. Miracle book winding up losing readers towards the end. Now, he won an award for this, but his big problem is paying off. And I see that happen with a lot of writers not understanding that the payoff is one of the most important parts of the story, because just as you have built up the rising action in the story, you have to make it fall towards the end to a conclusion where the reader comes out of the story feeling satisfied that the goals that the hero set were accomplished, the obstacles were overcome in a satisfactory manner, and that things ended in a way that has the story getting ready to begin again, and then building that anticipation towards getting the reader anticipating the next book. So these are important key elements to storytelling, but because we don't have really good editorial at many of these comic book companies, they don't really understand this whole element of paying off a story. And Travis makes a good point. That's what happened with Game of Thrones as well. They just didn't understand. They set up things for 7 really solid seasons, and then instead of giving us the payoff that would have had us excited, what happened was with Game of Thrones season 8, people were disappointed because you did this great job of setting up to who's going to get this throne, but then at the end, you give us this anticlimactic ending or this weak ending, and this weak ending, it can kill everything. I mean, I remember Xena Warrior Princess, they had this finale, and that finale killed the entire series. I mean, people loved Xena Warrior Princess for the first 4 or 5 seasons, and then we got that 6th season, and that 6th season didn't give us that payoff, and the payoff and the ending that we got, it was just a complete turnoff, and it makes people go up to the point of season 5, and then they cut it off. They don't even want to watch season 6 because they had this really bad ending. And this is what happens when people don't really take a minute to sit down and really have a plan for where they want to go, a sketch of where they want to go for the endings of their book. When you don't have a sketch for where you want the ending to go, then the book is just not going to end well for the writer, and it's not going to end well because you've alienated the audience and you've turned the audience away from your product. What's going on, Benny G? I'm glad to see you here. Today we are talking about paying off story. And I wanted to do a writing live stream because I wanted to get back to things as related to fantasy and storytelling. And I've looked at all of these different comics and sci-fi and fantasy, and I'm not really seeing people working on the endings of their stories, because I read a lot of comics and I read a lot of different and I watch a lot of different shows. Like I was watching Cannon Busters, and Cannon Busters, it had a promising start, but the ending just was a jumbled mess. And it was a jumbled mess because your LaShawn Thomas really didn't think about where he wanted to take his characters. And that's one of the other things that you have to think about when you pay off a story is, where do you want to take the character when you finish the story? So what lesson do you want your character to learn? What obstacle do you want them to overcome? And where do you want to see the character after the climax of the story? So these are things you have to think about when you're doing a story. Is you really want to think about where this character is going to go, how this character is going to overcome this final challenge in the climax. And after they finish this climax, where does that conclude the story? Because when you're trying to conclude a story, then you really want to have that conclusion, again, wrap up all of the details you set up in the first act, deal with that second plot point, and then go out and then make sure that your conclusion is something where the hero beats the bad guys and then prepares for the next book, and then begins to build that anticipation for the next book. So that was something I thought about with E-Steam Goddess Of. Now, E-Steam Goddess Of took place after the events of E-Steam Ascension, where E-Steam got new powers. And in the story, I wanted to give people a showcase of E-Steam's new powers, but I also wanted to show where the character, how the story would pay off in a way that once we saw E-Steam's new powers, we started to see that she was focused on continuing to focus on this brand new direction for her life. So I wanted to set the story up where she's taking on this Avarice the Tormentor, but I wanted it to pay off that after she beat this Avarice the Tormentor, then what happened was we started to see her starting to move forward in terms of her direction as a character, and we start to see where she's going in her new role and with her new power. So I really wanted it to pay off strong, because a strong payoff is something that's important when you have a story, especially one that sets up the first part of a new story arc. And this book was the first part of the new story arc for the new E-Steam series after Ascension. So I really wanted to make sure that this book paid off strong after setting up and introducing E-Steam's new powers. I wanted it to show that she was focusing on her new role and her new direction. So I wanted it to pay off so that we start, after she beats the bad guy, we start seeing her building anticipation for the next story to show for her new direction. Same thing with John Haynes' Dark Succubus. With Dark Succubus, I set it up where, yes, John Haynes takes on the Selene the Succubus, but I wanted to, in the conclusion, after he beats the Succubus, then focus on building things up for the next story, which is John Haynes, the Man with Nothing to Lose. So I wanted to take character points in the character transformation arc and begin to use them again to pay this after I pay the story off, where he beats the bad guys, then focus on where I want to take the character. So paying off a story is very important, because it, again, is about endings and beginnings, and it's about where you want to take the characters after they have overcome the obstacles. So if you have in the climax and the conclusion, you want to give that reader that satisfying conclusion to the story, and you want to give them that payment for investing their time in reading your book, whether it be 16 pages or 600 pages. You want to be able to give that reader that ending and give them something for their time, because people's time is extremely precious, and people, once they lose time, they can't get it back. And there's nothing more frustrating for a reader than a book where they don't get that payoff for all of their time. And if people don't get their payoff for their time, then what they realize, what they do is they become frustrated at you. And the reason why they become frustrated at you is because you have wasted their time, and nobody wants to have their time wasted. I'm glad to see you here, Mr. Fuselier. I'm glad that you're here at one of my live streams, and I'm going to start trying to focus more on teaching live streams. Usually during the Wednesday ones, I want to do more writing and teaching ones, because I really want to get back to focus on fantasy and science fiction and comic books. And I want to do that one for the Wednesday, and I might focus on something else for the Friday one. But what I'm focusing on today is paying off a story. And again, you have to really think about that payoff, because that payoff is the thing that the reader is anticipating. When they hear about your book, they start reading, they want to get to that ending, and they want something good from that ending. So that's something every writer has to really focus on, is that ending. And I see a lot of books these days, a lot of writers, they go to the first act, and the first act is great. The first act does a great job of setting up. The first act does a great job of introducing characters. The first act does a great job of introducing premise. But where they start to fall apart is middle second act, because after they get to the first plot point, they really don't put that much work into the second act, and that's where the story starts to stumble. And as the story starts to stumble, what some people try to do is they try to keep pushing the story along. But if you continue to try to push the story along and force things, then things don't flow organically. And if things don't flow organically for you as a writer, then what's going to happen is the reader isn't going to be compelled to keep reading the story. And if the reader isn't compelled to keep reading the story, and they have to push and force themselves to keep moving the story along, and they're just trying to push, that, then they're going to wind up getting frustrated. And then what's going to happen is, once they get to the conclusion, they're not going to get that payoff that they wanted. And if they don't get that payoff, again, then what's going to happen is they're not going to pay to read any more of your books. So you can go out here, and you have to be able to get that payoff to that reader. You have to be able to pay them for their time with that conclusion. And if you're stuck on a second act, like I was stuck on a second act for a couple of books, one of the things a writer has to do is you got to let the story rest, because the story is not telling itself. And if it's not telling itself, nothing you can do can force that story to go forward. So what you want to do, if you're struggling on a second act, then what you want to do is go out here and really let that story rest. Go have some fun, go live your life for a while. And then what's going to happen is, once you move away from the story, you may get inspired and then be able to come back. That happened to me on a screenplay I did called Spray 'Em Up. And it also happened for me with ISIS, the main event. When I was with ISIS, the main event, I had a little bit of a jam on the second act. But then after I took a minute to listen to one of my Facebook friends' music mixes, I got the inspiration again, and I was finally able to finish the story. I'm glad to see you here, Leah. I like doing the live streams. I'm going to try to do more writing-oriented ones and story-oriented ones and comic book-oriented ones for Wednesdays. I don't know about Fridays. Akum, how do you prevent plot holes? One, you have to really look at your outline and look at your story. And what if you do an outline, or what you do is you have to really read your story over and look at it from a critical perspective. Because I've had stories where I would take a critical look at them and say, okay, that's a plot hole. I need to fix that. But plot holes happen when you're just in a rush to write and you're not really thinking about how it fits within the structure of your story. So you really want to focus on the structure of your story, and you really want to take a look at the points that you want to do in your story. For example, I remember with a couple of books like Spinsterella, I wrote a whole outline, and that outline really helped me figure out where the story was going, where the plot points were going, and where the direction of the story was going, and to look for, things that did not fit within the story as I was writing it. And that outline is one of the things that can help you with a story, because with an outline, and I usually use a synopsis style outline of each chapter or the overall story. So I know where the story is supposed to go, and I know where the story is supposed to end. So I have a sketch of what the payoff is going to be. And if I have that outline, it'll tell me where the story is going. And if I'm writing the story, if there's a hole in the story, I can catch that, and then either I can revise it depending on where I am in the story to prevent it from being a plot hole, or I can restructure the story so that it doesn't become a plot hole. So those are two things you can do as a writer to go out here and avoid having these plot holes in your story. But plot holes usually happen when a story isn't really planned out well and when a writer is rushing. And I saw that with Avengers Endgame. Story had a lot of plot holes, and then you had writers going out of their way to try to explain what was going on. But you don't want, as a writer, you don't want to sit there and explain to the reader what's going on. They should be able to figure out what's going on based on the action in the story. And a good writer, what they want to do is make sure that everything is there on the page of the story, because if everything is on the page of the story, then everything is explained to the reader in a clear fashion. And that's something you want to do when you're writing a story, is make sure that you're presenting everything clearly to the reader. Everything is explained to the reader, because if you have plot holes, then what happens is that that's going to create plot holes, and that's what happens when you don't write things clearly, is you get those plot holes, and they wind up making the story inconsistent for the reader. But you really want to have an outline to let you know where everything is, so you know where direction you want to go in, so that when you get to the conclusion of the story, you're going to pay that reader off with a great, satisfying ending that really gets them enthusiastic about the next book, gets them excited about the next book, and has them counting down the days to the next book. So that's something I try to do with my work, is I want to make sure that the reader is in a place where they feel like they want to count down the days to that next book, and they want to get excited about that next book and anticipate going out here to get that next book, because that ending is the thing that's going to sell the next book. So a lot of writers, they'll sit there and, like in the comic book industry right now, and they will start focusing on the promotion of the story and the start of the story. And the first issue, again, will be spectacular. But if you're not focused on the last issue, then you're going to have a hard time selling that character later on. So when I do stories, I usually, again, have that sketch, because I understand the last part of the story is just as important as the first. And the second act is another part that I usually focus on. And that second act is one that really needs to drive the story and move it quickly. So when I was starting with books like Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, one of the things I did was I took Sid Field's story model, where he talked about, a 3-act paradigm. And I took a model that I took from manga, and I said, I need to make an anime and make that second act fairly short so that we can get to this third act and pay off. Because a lot of times the second act can really impede the third act, because you know a lot of writers, what they want to do is cram so much information into the second act, not understanding that if your second act is slow, then the reader's going to get taken out of the story, and then you're not going to get to the payoff point. And I saw that with your Doomsday Clock. I saw that there where the second act just went on, and the same thing with Tom King's Batman, where this second act just goes on and on and on. And with a second act, what you want to do is get the reader in, let them know what's setting up, then get them out, and then get them into that third act, and then get that third act ramping up towards that climax, and then hitting that conclusion, which pays the whole story off. Because the faster you get the reader in the story, the faster you can get them to that ending. And that's what you want to do, is get the reader excited, get them compelled, and get them into the story from the first page, and have them where they want to read that story all the way to the last page. So most writers today, they're not thinking about getting that reader to the last page. And because they're not thinking about getting the reader to the last page, that's why readers get frustrated and will drop comics that are in there after the first issue or after the second. You'll see these big 50 and 60% drops in sales. And the reason why you see these big 50 and 60% drops in sales is because they'll set things up, but then a lot of times, again, they don't pay off. Or in the cases of some of these SJW books, like I was reading the Kamala Khan Ms. Marvel, Magnificent Ms. Marvel #1, then well, Leah, I can't afford a post office box right now. All I can do is PayPal and Patreon. And again, if you want to donate to the Cash App, you can donate to the Cash App, or you can donate to the Patreon, or you can buy books on Amazon. When you buy books from Amazon, I really appreciate that, because that really helps. It helps get the sales up, and it helps me. It helps a long way with getting more books out there. So I can't afford a post office box just yet. And there's also the thing with checks and money orders. So I can only take electronic donations right now. But Leah, I would love to get a post office box, but post office boxes cost money. And sometimes in the neighborhoods like I'm in, sometimes post office boxes just aren't available. So I'm not at that stage yet. So, but if you guys want to donate to the Patreon or the PayPal, you can donate to PayPal via sjsdirectamerica@gmail.com. You can send a PayPal donation there, or you can buy the books on Amazon.com, because every book that you buy, again, that helps out lots, just like the donations help out lots. Yeah, I heard about that, D. Woodward. 78. I heard about that ridiculous plan to have Ms. Marvel replace Spider-Man in the MCU, and that would be a complete disaster, because Ms. Marvel cannot even carry her own book. It's just like I was saying a minute ago, her book really, she can't pay off a story, and that's a big problem with the Ms. Marvel character, is that she cannot pay off a story. She has no way of. You don't need you don't need a Patreon account to donate. You can just donate if you want to. Or you can donate to the Cash App, and it's no problem. Hi, Omio. Glad to see you here. Yeah, I'm talking about paying off a story. And again, Ms. Marvel doesn't pay off very well. I've read a couple of her story arcs, and you don't get that satisfying conclusion. And that's why her book sells so poorly, because she just doesn't give you a satisfying ending to her story. And a lot of times with Kamala Khan, she really doesn't really set up very well. A lot of her premises, they really don't draw you in from the first page. And that's something a writer has to do, is they have to draw you in order to pay off the story. And oftentimes she will wind up turning you off on the first plot point. I remember reading Magnificent Ms. Marvel #1, And when I saw the melting parents, that was it for me. I was like, okay, I'm done here. And you don't really want readers to sit there and say they're done here after reading one story. You want them to sit there and say, hey, I got to go get this next book. Because if they're saying they're going to go get this next book, they're going to want to share that book with their friends, and they're going to want to share that book with all of the people they know because they're excited about that book. And again, payoffs can get people really excited about a story. And that's something as a writer you really want, is to get people excited about your work. So that's why payoffs are very important, because sometimes a great ending can lead to people picking up your work and wanting more of your work. But today's writers, they have not really, as I see it, been trained on working on a conclusion, and the editors really haven't been preparing them to teach them how to get to the point where you can provide that reader with that satisfying conclusion. What they will do is they will end a story in an awkward way, or they will end it in a forced way. And a lot of times they will bring in things like deus ex machinas, or they will try to come up with twist endings that really don't come out of anything organic. And if you're going to do a twist ending, you have to come out of something that you introduced early on in the story. I remember I was doing the mystery story, Isis, All About the Goddess, back in 2013. And this was the first mystery I had written. And I said, if I'm going to do a mystery, I have to make sure that the ending is satisfactory, and it also has to have that twist that comes out of the beginning of the story. So if I'm going to do a mystery and I'm going to do a twist ending, the twist has to be something organic from the story. Because I remember watching the movie In the Heat of the Night, where they had this murder and Mr. Tibbs had to come down south to solve this murder. And the twist in the mystery, it came straight out of the story. There was no surprise out of nowhere. It came organically from the beginning of the movie, and it was a satisfying ending because it came from the beginning of the movie. We didn't expect that guy to be the murderer, but this was the murderer, and it made logical sense when you took a look at the whole movie In the Heat of the Night, which stars Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger. Once you look at the mystery of it, it really worked overall. Going forward, Bombor, I don't know who should lead the MCU. I mean, at this point, with it being SJW MCU, I'm just walking away from it. And that whole thing with the MCU, I don't know who should lead it, because they want Captain Marvel, but she cannot open a movie, and I don't think any of these SJW characters are going to make me care. I mean, Phase 4, that's where I'm just phasing it out. So, yeah, Kuhn, I mean, I love Rod Serling's twist endings. I mean, Twilight Zone, all the ones he did always had great twist endings. He always did a great job. Rod Serling is a master of paying off stories. When you look at a Rod Serling story, he'll do this great setup, but what really makes his books work is the payoff. He will pay a story off in such a way, and he'll pay it off in a way that makes you think about things and think about life, and make you think about things overall. And that's one of the things I liked about Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. I mean, if you're a writer, I recommend you go watch the Twilight Zone. I think it's on Netflix right now. And once you watch some of those episodes, you're going to learn something about how to really write stories. Because Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, he knows how to put things in a story where they're between the lines. And he also knows how to do those twist endings. And he knows how to really pay off a story. I mean, you watch him, you watch Alfred Hitchcock. He's another master of paying off a story. I mean, if you think about the Norman Bates Psycho, nobody saw that ending. And this is, when you watch Psycho and you get that payoff, you're like, who's doing all these murders? Who's the psycho? And then you get the ending with Norman Bates being his own mother. that payoff is something that people never forgot, and it really cemented Alfred Hitchcock as a master craftsman in storytelling. So those are the good things to watch when if you want to learn more about payoff, is watching those Twilight Zone episodes, watching things like Alfred Hitchcock. I can also recommend the show Have Gun Will Travel. That's a Western from the 50s, but Gene Roddenberry worked on that one, and it showed a lot of the type of social commentary he put into his stories before he came to Star Trek. And if you watch Have Gun Will Travel, it's really, the writing there is really some of the best writing as related to television, but you can also learn for other types of storytelling like the novel and like comic books. So you can learn a lot from watching different types of payoffs, and there's those payoffs that, again, they become unforgettable endings. I mean, those Twilight Zone endings, I can think of several other movies. Okay, we got a troll here who is playing like they're Cuba Gooding Jr., and I've already flagged them, so I'm just gonna put this dude. But all of those are examples of really great writing. I mean, if you have a good payoff, you can have something like Empire Strikes Back. When I think of another great payoff, I think of Empire Strikes Back, which we get this big build up to Luke learning about the Force. Thank you, Mr. Fuselig, for buying Spellbound. I really appreciate it. That's the book that starts the Spinsterella trilogy, and that one has the payoff with that was the origin story of Matilda Crowley and how she came into the goth scene, and then that story it's off strong, and it gives you that satisfying conclusion, which turns into legendary, which builds into legendary Mad Matilda, and then legendary builds into Spinsterella. But one of the greatest payoffs was Empire Strikes Back, and if you really want to see a great payoff, you have the Empire Strikes Back, where Luke is going on this quest to be this Jedi, and he's thinking it's all about revenge as related to getting even with Darth Vader, and it leads to that big lightsaber battle, and it's that big lightsaber battle that is the huge payoff for Empire Strikes Back. And it gives us that bad plot twist, that great plot twist where Darth Vader tells Luke that he's his father. But with that plot twist where Luke winds up getting that revelation, he realizes that being a hero isn't all the fun and games that he thought it was with the first Star Wars. And he realizes that things are a bit more serious now that he knows that Darth Vader is his father. And he realizes that he has to go out here and do more to be a hero. So it sets up an amazing thing for Return of the Jedi. So that ending gives us that satisfying conclusion of Empire Strikes Back, but it also sets up Return of the Jedi. So that's an example of a great payoff for a story. I mean, you got things that built up from Star Wars with Luke being this young kid who thinks that he's this great hero because he blew up the Death Star, and he's thinking being a hero is one way, but then with Empire Strikes Back, and then he finds out that Darth Vader is his father, he then learns, he gets an extra dimension onto being a hero. So that payoff, it really made that movie to be absolutely, as I call it, one of the few perfect movies ever made. I mean, I look at Empire Strikes Back, I look at that film from a technical perspective and a story perspective. That movie had one of the most perfect films ever made. And I can only say that maybe about a couple of films. I can say that about Marty. I can say it about Sunset Boulevard. I can say that about Human Desire. Human Desire is another film that you really need to take a look at, because that payoff is amazing for Human Desire. And that's a noir film. Chinatown is all right, Bombor, but it's all right. It's got a couple of good twists. I've seen it, but when I think of really great movies that have good payoffs, I mean, RoboCop, the first one from '87, has a great payoff. I mean, these are when you watch really great movies, you can see how payoffs work. And when you see how great payoffs work, then you can really understand how to make that work for your writing. And that's one of the things I try to do is I try to read enough stuff so that I can give people a good payoff in a story, because I know that if you don't pay the story off, then what's going to happen is the reader is just not going to be satisfied. You really want to get those readers satisfied. You really want to get them excited. And excuse me, you want to get them enthusiastic about your work so that it's building that strong word of mouth. And that's something that most writers today, again, they're not really focusing on the way they should be focusing on, because they are a lot of times too in their feelings about their stories, and they're too afraid to let go of things as related to their feelings. That's another thing that leads to you not being able to pay off a story, is when you're emotional and you're emotionally attached to characters, you're afraid to let things happen to characters. And I see that with a lot of comic book writers today. I can see with a lot of characters, like with the Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, I can see the emotional attachment to the characters, and that prevents the characters from growing. And what writers have to do when you're out here is you have to understand that you can't get emotionally attached to the characters, because that's going to prevent you from allowing that character to grow and allowing them to achieve the goals of the character transformation arc. So if you get too emotionally attached to a character, then they can't grow to that next level. So I understood what I was doing with the East-Team character when I was working with her on the East-Team series. So in order for her to get to the point of becoming the goddess of, I had to be objective in her development so that she could move past being the devilish diva. Now, the East-Team, when she was the devilish diva, had one set of powers, but she was working towards becoming stronger in God and in her relationship with God. And she was trying to grow into a person who was trying to have a better relationship with the living God. So in order for her to do that, she had to let things go. She had to move things forward. And I had to let the character grow organically. And that was the only way the character could grow to become the goddess of in this story. So that's something that I wanted to do with this story. Again, I wanted to, pay off the reader for the 8 books that they read from No Good Deed to Ascension, and pay them off in Ascension with a satisfying conclusion where the East-Team character changed. And I also wanted to give readers as I started to set up, more of a payoff in Goddess Of. So every story you do, you want to be able to set it up, and then you want to be able to pay it off, because every time you pay off a story, then that's, again, what gets that reader interested in reading more stories. So that's something every reader wants from a story, is that payoff. And they want those endings that really get you into things. They really want to get that ending, and they want that ending to be something that really shows them that this story was worth their time, and that this story was worth all of the minutes that they spent sitting there and investing in it. So that's something that I've learned reading books, reading comic books, watching movies, and it's something that I take very seriously in my craft as a writer. As a writer, I take it very seriously when I'm working towards the end of a book, because I really want that ending to really get the reader satisfied about what they've read. And I really want that ending to really get people excited about the story. And I wanted to make that story so compelling that when you get to that ending, you feel like you've read something great and you've really enjoyed what you've read. I've had readers on one book I did, A Recipe for Success, tell me how much they enjoyed that book. And I've had readers tell me on Temptation of John Haynes how they love that book. And that's something that I wanted to do. I wanted the reader to come out of the book enjoying the book, having a good time, and coming to the point where they're saying, oh, I love that book so much that, and the thing is that the ending is a major part of them enjoying the book. Leah, yeah, 20, we got 24 in the chat and 24 watching, and let's get the likes up. I really appreciate it. But you really want that, you want the readers to come in saying, yeah, I love this story. I love this story, and I want to go see more of this. And that's something a writer has to think about when they're doing a story. They just can't just say, hey, I'm just going to put an ending on here, any old ending. You have to put a great ending on that story. And when you put a great ending on that story, then what's going to happen is you're going to wind up getting that reader so excited that they're going to want to read more and get excited for more and ask for more. And if you're an author, you really want your readers asking for more, because the more that they're asking for, that means that you're going to be able to sell more books to the reader in the future. Well, I'm going to get ready to wrap today's stream up. I want to thank everybody for coming to today's stream. And I'm really trying to get my fiction sales up. So I would really appreciate it if you picked up John Haynes' Dark Succubus in paperback, in Kindle formats, or if you picked up Isis, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle formats, or Esteem Goddess of in paperback and Kindle formats. And all three of these books in the 2019 SJS Direct catalog, all three of these books are free on Kindle if you have Kindle Unlimited. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, again, you can read them for free. And I also have a whole catalog of Isis, Esteem, and John Haynes series books, not to mention the books of the Spinsterella trilogy. And all of those books have great setups, but they also have great conclusions. So I want to thank everybody for coming out to the stream, and I hope you'll be there for the next stream, which might possibly be Friday. And again, I hope you guys go out and pick up the books in the SJS Direct catalog, because I really want people to pick up some great stories and see what a satisfying conclusion looks like. And thank you, Mr. Fuselig, for picking up Spellbound, and thank you for coming to my stream. And I hope you'll be here for the next stream, possibly on Friday.